and welcome to another The Old World video. I've had a bit of a bee in my bonnet these last few days. I've been listening to Orc Slayer on Audible, absolutely stonking book if you've not read or heard it, but it got me thinking about a few things. So Warhammer The Old World is coming, hopefully not too far off, and as I mentioned in my last video, there's a number of things that we can deduce from the information that Games Workshop have provided us so far. So, this video I want to talk a little bit about special characters. One of the things that I always felt made Warhammer was the Herohammer element to it, which was that the number of funky, larger-than-life personas that made up the Warhammer world. The difficulty is, Warhammer The Old World, as I've already mentioned, is not set in the same timeline as the original Warhammer was. It's set 200 or 300 years before what was kind of the common era of Warhammer Fantasy. What that means is a number of characters that we'd grown to know and love, like Joseph Bugman or Skarsnik and Gobbler, they simply weren't around back then. What I have done is I've sat down and worked out, at least in particular in relation to the major armies that Games Workshop have said are going to be part and parcel of the Old World series, I've had a little think about which special characters from that army were around at the time that we think Warhammer The Old World is going to be set. So, without further ado, here are my thoughts on that. First and foremost, what do we know about Warhammer The Old World? We know that it's set in the time of the Three Emperors. Now that's, unfortunately, doesn't really narrow it down very much, because the time of the Three Emperors was centuries of strife and civil war within the Empire before it finally came to an end with the ascension of Magnus the Pious and the First Great War against Chaos. What we do know, therefore, then, is that the time of Warhammer The Old World is going to be set pre-Magnus the Pious. How far before Magnus the Pious? It's not entirely clear. But it means that we can fairly safely discount anything that came about from that point onwards. So from 2300 onwards, as by the Imperial calendar. What else do we know? Well, we do know who the King of Bretonnia is during the time that Warhammer The Old World is set. It's King Luon the Orc Slayer, who only ever really got one mention in the Bretonnia book prior to this as King Luon the Orc Slayer, who declared a crusade against the Orcs in 2201 and basically, again that's by the Imperial calendar, sought to rid Bretonnia of the Orcish hordes, to the point where the Orcs were basically driven back to the appropriately named Massif Orcal and the forests of Shalon, and that was basically it. So we know that we're looking at a time period sometime between 2201 and 2300. So it's a 100-year time period, give or take. What I've worked out then is which famous kind of old world special characters were alive, and I use the word alive, were active, shall we say, during that time period. Here's what I've come up with. First and foremost, for Bretonnia, we know we had the Fey Enchantress and the Green Knight. As I've already mentioned in my previous video, these are basically immortal characters who've been around since the dawn of Bretonnia and make regular reappearances. I think it's fairly safe to say that if we do get special characters in the upcoming Old World game, then they will feature. I'm hopeful, as I've said before, that we'll get re-release of the miniatures, or else maybe even some new beautiful sculpts inspired by them. Who else, though, was around at that time? Well, interestingly, looking at the High Elves, who we know are going to be one of the armies that feature in Warhammer The Old World, Tyrion and Teclis were around at that point. We know that they were born about 43 years, or there are 44 years, before the time of King Luon the Orc Slayer, as mentioned. Date of birth by the Imperial calendar for the twin brothers Tyrion and Teclis, 2157. So, certainly, they would be alive at the point that Warhammer The Old World was set. Now, they would be younger. I mean, they'd be barely 50 years old, which by an elven standard is nothing. It's practically rebellious teenagers. But it does mean that if we are looking at special characters, we are probably going to see Tyrion and Teclis making an appearance in the High Elf army in whatever format it takes. Likewise, Alariel, the Everqueen, was alive at that point, and then she remained the Everqueen all the way through till the point where she's now become one of the gods of Age of Sigmar. The other character that was alive at that point, and which we've never had a miniature for, but I would love to see a miniature for, especially because we've got a fairly accurate description of him, we've got a load of information about him that came about through the Warhammer Total War games, the Phoenix King at that time, Finnebar the Seafarer. Now he's described as wearing this incredibly detailed, gilded red dragon scale armour, crimson cloaks, and wielding a kind of an Indish scimitar that blazes with light. I think it would be awesome, especially given this is earlier on in his reign, and it's a point in time when we know that Finnebar was still travelling around and carrying out some of the explorations that gave him his famous seafaring name. I think it would be awesome if the Games Workshop, and in particular Forge World, took the opportunity to produce a Phoenix King model who could then be used in army, sort of games of Warhammer The Old World with the High Elf army. That's my major wish list, I suppose, in terms of special characters who don't have a model yet, but who should hopefully make an appearance. Beyond that, we know that Cetra was active during this period. We also know that Queen Calida, who again had a previous existing special character model, was active during this period, and Apophis, the Scarab King, was active, albeit Games Workshop have said they're not re-releasing Finecast models, and he's only ever had a Finecast model, so unless they're planning to replace him or cast it in metal, which would be interesting to see, then I don't know whether or not we'll like to see a return of his model. Beyond that, there are a few. I know they've said that Tomb Kings are going to be involved in this, but the Vampire Counts aren't. But there are a few generic undead characters who have been fairly major in terms of Warhammer history and who would have been active at this time and who I'm hopeful might make an appearance. So Arcan the Black. Now, of course, we've got a model for Arcan the Black at the moment as he appears as one of the Mortarchs of Nagash. But what I'm talking about is Arcan the Black as he appeared in Undead background back in the day when he rode on a giant flying skeletal chariot that was made of manticore wings. I don't necessarily say that they need to re-release that model, albeit I have that model and it's awesome. But I would love to see some kind of homage to that making an appearance. Perhaps not Nagash himself making an appearance, although we know that he had recuperated from his battle against Sigmar by that point. But Arcan the Black would be an awesome model to see. Beyond that, there are a couple of other undead characters who, again, are mentioned fairly heavily in the Warhammer background, but have never had models. We know that, again, I know they've said vampires aren't going to be part of it. I'm going to mention this anyway. Count Luther Harken. Whilst the von Carsteins were laid low, and Neferata was lying low, and Abarash was off discovering how to drink dragon blood to make friends and influence people, Luther Harken was gathering a massive force on the coast of the Southlands, on the coast of Lustria, sorry. And again, who wouldn't love to see a vampire pirate model? Beyond that, though, there's one other character who's been mentioned multiple times in the Warhammer background, but has never had a model, and who we know for definite was active during that period, and that is the great necromancer, Constant Drachenfels. Now, for those of you who don't know, Drachenfels is one of those really old characters who actually predates much of Warhammer history. I know when I did my Painter Lore video about the undead, I said that Nagash was the first necromancer. Technically, Constant Drachenfels is in fact the first necromancer, albeit he's not often thought of as such. He's referred to instead as the Great Enchanter. Constant Drachenfels is probably the first mortal human to discover magic and find a way to exploit it for, again, making friends and influencing people. He predates the fall of the Chaos Gate and the rise of the Chaos Gods. So in many respects, he's described in the background as somebody who views the Chaos Gods as newcome pikers compared to his amazing abilities. He was eventually defeated by Genevieve Duodone and the poet Detlef Sierck in the novel Drachenfels, but that didn't come until the reign of Emperor Karl Franz. What that means is Drachenfels should still be around and fairly active during the time of Warhammer The Old World. Perfect opportunity to give this classic character a model. Beyond that, in the woodland realms of the Wood Elves, we know that Orion and Ariel were still alive and kicking at that time, and because of what we know about them at that point, we also know of one particular Beastman character who made repeated appearances during the time, including during the time that Warhammer The Old World is likely to be set. And that's Morgur the Corrupted, the Beast Lord, the kind of constantly mutating Chaos Spawn Beast Lord character that they introduced during 6th edition Beastmen. All of those have had models in some way, shape or form. I'm not sure necessarily that they would re-release the Ariel model. Maybe we'd get a new Ariel model, which would be fantastic. But certainly the Orion model was new when Wood Elves got their resculpt, and there is nothing to prevent them from re-releasing that. The dwarves, unfortunately, almost all of the dwarven characters that we know and love, Gotrek, Bugman, the High King Thorgrim, those all come much later. But there is one dwarven character who we know was around and active during the time of Warhammer The Old World, and that is the White Dwarf himself, Grombrindle, who's had a number of miniatures over the years, and I think there'd be nothing to stop them taking the opportunity of Warhammer The Old World to either re-release some or all of those, or release a new White Dwarf miniature, because we haven't had one of those for quite some time. Beyond that, there's no real Empire characters that were alive during this period. There's no real Orc or Goblin characters that we know and love that were alive during this period. The famous Grot warlord that I love, Grom the Paunch, didn't come until nearly 150 years after the time period that we're talking about. Likewise, other Orcish characters like Azag the Slaughterer came much later. I know they said the Dark Elves aren't going to be part of the major storyline, but there are two characters, of course, who are worthy of mention from the Dark Elves, and that is Malekith and Morathi. Both of those were still alive and fully active during this period, and if the High Elves are getting a look in, there is nothing to stop them from maybe either re-releasing some of the Sixth Ed models of those, or at the very least giving us rules for them. So if you've got those models, you can use them. That's all I've got thus far. I hope you've enjoyed just this brief whistle-stop tour through my speculations as to special characters that might make an appearance during the Warhammer The Old World game. I'm looking forward to maybe meeting some new special characters as well. Something like maybe the High King of the Dwarves from that period. Maybe something like King Luon the Orc Slayer finally getting his own model. Maybe something like all three of the contenders for the Imperial throne getting their own models. Those would certainly be cool. I will leave you with this thought, and that is that special characters, I think, played a major part of what made Warhammer Fantasy. They've said that the Warhammer The Old World is going to be a compilation of all the things that made Warhammer Fantasy great. It falls to my thinking, therefore, that must include special characters. So let's see what Games Workshop release next. Games Workshop, the ball is over in your court. I look forward to the next Warhammer The Old World newsflash. Bye for now.